Welcome back to the Decolonized Christian Podcast, where we dismantle harmful theology and reimagine the Christian witness together. In this week's episode, we're going to bring you into the conversation that we are always having about white supremacy. And so I'm excited about this one today. And Greg, are you ready to jump into this thing, man?
I'm ready.
All right. So I want to start us out in 1906 with the Naturalization Act of 1906, which allowed only free white persons and persons of African nativity or persons of African descent to naturalize, so as citizens. So you are only a citizen of the United States in 1906 through this act, where you are a free white person, or you are a person of African nativity, or a person of African descent. And so very, very strict guidelines, very, very narrow perspective on what a U.S. citizen is. Now, in 1922, a gentleman by the name of Tekoa Ozawa, hopefully I'm saying that right, Ozawa, goes before the Supreme Court and says, hey, I want to be a citizen. So he is a Japanese American who was born in Japan, but he lived in the U.S. for 20 years. And his whole argument was, I'm not going to challenge the constitutions when it comes to the racial restrictions, but instead I'm going to say that Japanese people were properly classified as free white persons, because in this time you had the civilized, the semi-civilized, and the barbarians. So the civilized were white people. The semi-civilized were Asian Americans, Japanese Americans. And then your barbarians were black people. And so he uses this structure against the Supreme Court and says, hey, I'm not going to argue that I'm not white, but what I am going to argue is that I'm a free person. And so I don't fall into this free white person category, but I do fall into the free category based on your structure of me being a semi-civilized human being in your country. And essentially what came about from that case is that they said, nah, man, you can't do that, because if you are not white, like DNA wise, like you are not white. Ethnically, you are semi-civilized, you are free, but you are not white. So therefore your citizenship can't be granted. And so, not surprising, sounds very familiar. But then we get to 1923, when I know I'm going to butcher this name, but it's Baga Thind versus the U.S. in 1923. And Thind looked back at the case in 1922 and said, okay, if you're going to use that logic of DNA, if DNA is like the prerequisite to becoming a citizen of the United States, he was going to argue that he had European descent in him. So he was an Indian, and he claimed that because of where he grew up, it was European. And so he's like, I have this influence, I have this DNA, and I'm going to, again, go at it at the structure of, I'm not a free white person, but I am semi-civilized because I'm not black, and I also have European DNA in my lineage. And so he makes this argument, and it's a pretty good argument, because in 1922 we've already established that DNA is key to getting citizenship. If you are white, then you are a citizen. So if you can prove that you have some type of ancestral DNA in you that makes you white, then you should be a citizen, right? Makes sense. But they come back and say, nah, man, that's not going to work for us. And being white is, quote, common sense. It doesn't fit into the, quote, common sense definition of whiteness. And the exact words, were, if you, well, I'm going to paraphrase, if you are white, then you know it, was their argument. If you have to ask, or like, if you have to think about if you are white or not, then maybe you're not. Whiteness is something you know internally. That was the Supreme Court's logical reasoning for denying Finn citizenship. So from the very beginning, to be a citizen of the United States, you see these socially constructed ideas of race and how they play out. And so whiteness is constantly shifting the rules to exclude upward mobility of people who are not 100% white. We see that very clearly. And so I would love for that kind of concept to be the cornerstone of our conversation on white supremacy. Now, shifting gears, I've talked to you personally about this piece of data, but I think it's well worth talking with our audience about it. So the Barna Group put out a survey in 2020, and we will put a link to that report in our show notes. But the question is, and it was to a Christian audience, do you think our country has a race problem? And the percentages are those who said definitely. So these are the people that said, without a doubt, 100% yes. Okay. So it's yes. So in 2019, for white adults, it was 46%. Sorry. This is all U.S. citizens, and then self-identified Christians is how they compare it. So in 2019, 46% of all U.S. adults said that there was a race problem in our country. And then those who are self-identified Christians in 2019, 40% of them said that there was a race problem in our country. So 46% of the overall adults said yes, 40% of self-identified Christians said yes. And now we get to 2020, where 37% of all U.S. Americans say that there is a race problem in our country. Now, self-identified Christians say that 33% say that there is a race relation problem. So from 2019 to 2020, there's a 7% decrease amongst white Christians, and them even saying there is a problem about race. Now, when it comes to Black Americans, 72% in 2019 of all U.S. adults said there was, and then in self-identified Christians, it was 75%. So that's a 3% difference, right? So more self-identified Black Christians say, yes, race is, there is a problem. And in 2020, 76% of all U.S. adults say that there is a problem with race. And then in 2020, self-identified Christians, it's 81%. So there's a huge
81% of
Black Christians in 2020 say, yes, race is a problem in our country. And that was even up 6%. So I know that was a lot of numbers, and I fumbled over it. Give me grace, Greg. Give me grace. But really what I want to talk about is this 2020 stat, man, of white adults, self-identified Christians, Christian adults, 33% say that there is a race problem, which, if we do the math,
there's a staggering difference.
Yes, and if we do the math, that's what, 77% to like.
Well, I'm just talking about the staggering difference between the self-identified white Christians and the self-identified Black.
So let's talk about that. So that's 33% and 81%. 81%. So 33% and 81%. Now we're going to get into white supremacy. So it's always helpful to begin with the question, what is white supremacy? And I love to tell people it is not just a hate group. It is not the person with the, it's not just the person with the Confederate flag flying from their truck. It's not just KKK members holding that card, burning crosses, wearing sheets, dirty sheets probably. It's not just that, but white supremacy is a perspective and it's an ideology that is woven deeply into our experience, and we've been socialized in it. So it is very familiar to us, number one, and also, as we talked about on our last episode, it can be this invisible wall that is there that presents itself and it constantly centers itself. So there is a Chicana theorist by the name of Gloria Anzaldúa, and in her book Borderlands, she talks about this beautiful structure of, if you take a box, just draw a box. There's an inside and an outside of that box, right? So the inside of the box is this white dominant center where the norms are established and become the standard for everything, and the conditions need to work, but they work according to the dominant perspective. So there's nothing going to be outside of that system that can change it, that is effective, because it has to work within the dominant center, right? If it doesn't work for the powerful, then it's useless. In this dominant center, it generates ways of thinking and being and living that seek to dominate over those who are not at the center. And so that is the white dominant center. Think of a box. Commonly, when we say we don't want to put God in a box, what we're really saying is we don't want to put God in white supremacy.
That's interesting.
I think that's what we're really saying. And so outside of the box, it's called the borderlands. And so they were created by the white dominant center as a resource to exploitation. Now, the way I love to think about this, in our last episode, we talked about gentrification, right? So how this works is the white dominant center has that resource, right? They have access to a community, more than likely an impoverished community or trending that direction, and having the resources to go into that neighborhood and bring that resource back into the center. That's essentially what it means to gentrify an area. You bring those resources to it, and then you fundamentally change it, and you bring it back to the center. And so these borderlands are populated from those who don't fit in this normative state. And quite often, these folks are deemed as unfit, defiant, uncivilized, dangerous, and a threat to our well-being. And you can see through our former president, Donald Trump, that the fear-mongering language used, it's very much they. So us versus them. And to be fair, I think liberal and conservative circles do that all day long. It's us versus them, they versus us, them. But what happens in these borderlands is that people outside of this, they're viewed as different, and it's created and sustained by the white center of dominance to maintain that power. So the center can go out and fund projects, quite literally in the projects, and then they fund it and then they leave. And then that's it. Think about the many mission trips you have been on. I'm in the world of youth ministry, youth development, and I can't tell you how many times I have seen or even participated in trips where we just go with our wealth into a different community and our resources. We plop it there and then we leave. And it's like, that didn't generate any type of ownership or empowerment. What that did was it solidified the borderlands. And what I find fascinating is, to even get into the borderlands like I am now, I had to go to the dominant center. So think about these institutions that we have navigated today. So I drove my car in, like transportation. That's an institution. Healthcare, institution. Education, institution. For you to even be able to be in the borderlands and make a living, chances are you had to go through an institution that would give you some type of education so that you can enter into the borderlands and be a, quote, professional. And I think that's what I struggle with the most, because I do have my Master's of Arts in Youth Ministry from a seminary, and that seminary education allowed me the chance to be in communities where those institutions don't exist. Like they're not there. But and yet I gained access from it by it through the power of the white dominant center. And so I think we do this all the time. We call it code switching, right? Where we can talk the talk, walk the walk, and then as soon as we get out into the borderlands, it's like we shed that identity that we're putting up, and now we're just who we are. And so I find this perspective and this illustration very beneficial, because when we think about in our Christian theology, what's normative? Like what's normative when we talk about Black theology? That's very much in the borderlands, right? Like people don't really understand what we're talking about. That's why this is why we're recording this podcast. Our podcast is on the borderlands, and we're quite literally trying to expose the harmful theology of the center and to reimagine a Christian witness where we don't put God in this white supremacy box.
Right.
And again, white supremacy is not just a fringe hate group. It is an ideology that centers whiteness and white behaviors as standard, as the norm.
I think white supremacy is ever prevalent in society, as you said. And this past summer, when all of the stuff was happening with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, I was reading White Fragility. And so the author of that book, Robin DiAngelo, kind of spoke to the very things you're saying here. And for me, it's just kind of like a full circle moment. Like we don't really I don't think we understand the pervasiveness. I don't think we fully understand how insidious this ideology is. Because a lot of times what it goes back to is people looking at themselves individually and saying, this is not how I feel, this is not what I think. But in reality, if you peel back the layers, there's probably some deeply embedded stuff there that you haven't even realized. It hasn't bubbled up to the surface. But when things happen, like George Floyd, when stuff like that happens, it makes it known and the mask comes off. And so then we have to sit and deal with it and figure it out. And that's kind of what I think as Black people, that has been our whole life. That's been our whole existence. It's just figuring out how to navigate white spaces where whiteness is the standard, is the norm. And it's always centered. And it's just a ever ongoing thing, to where we really, I think we have to collectively come together and determine how it is we're going to combat what this is, this whiteness, this evil.
Yeah. I think it's very hard for white people to specifically hear that their culture. I really never hear people talk about white culture, and I find that fascinating. I don't know if you've ever heard that term in conversation. I haven't.
I haven't, and I think it's because deep down there's a knowing that.
That's where I was going.
What you say?
No, you read
well,
my
no,
mind.
There's a knowing of what whiteness represents, what it has always stood for, and there's not a lot of good. There's really no good in that, in honoring that. So to honor that would be to honor all the evil and atrocity that has come from that.
Yes, and for our people listening, again, we're talking about an ideology, not necessarily a racial identity, which I would argue that racial identity definitely plays a role, and it can be defined as white supremacy. but the hard thing to begin to dismantle for white people. So I am half white myself. I say half, but I took my little 23andMe and I'm like 60 something percent European or something or other. I don't know. I think the hardest part for me is to be like culturally, yes, like my ethnicity, whiteness is like part of my DNA, but that doesn't mean it has to be part of my ideology. And to separate the two is going to take a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah, because people always equate whiteness with white people, which is, I think it's natural to do that, but we have to understand there is a distinction.
Yes, there's a distinction, and I love to tell people, even people of color can be white supremacists. And as a side note, I always tell people this. So I start out with that, like, hey, do you know white supremacy? Like, I could be a white supremacist, and they're like, well, what do you mean? It was like, you ever seen the Dave Chappelle skit when he is a member of the KKK? Does a beautiful job, like through humor, to be like, dang, like even people of color can spew this hatred against their own kind.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Greg is raising his hand. I know y'all can't see us, but Greg is raising his hand. Come on through, Greg.
there is absolutely a a space where Black people exist at this this state of like anti-blackness
Talk about it.
among, whether it's themselves or whether it's other people. And this is just how insidious white supremacy is, because, you know, quick story. There was a something happened on Facebook, right? You know, Facebook is the place of happenings and things popping off. So there's a person that I'm Facebook friends with who made a comment about bonnets being worn in public. And so my first thought was, why are you commenting on this? But as I began to dissect it, um, the way that the status was framed was, if it started out with them saying there is no anti-blackness in me.
Hmm.
And that was a trigger, because I'm like, well, how can you say that? Like, to me as a Black person, to say that there's no anti-blackness within me means I've arrived.
Oof.
Which I don't ever think I'll arrive on this side of heaven, right? So for me to say that, it's just putting myself already in this elite, which is problematic. And then you go on to make the comment about, so you framed it that way, so you could say what you was going to say on the other side of the status,
Right.
which was about Black women not wearing bonnets in public. And so, like, we as Black people, we have these notions that we think, I guess, are respectable, but they could very well be rooted in anti-blackness. I don't I don't deny that the fact that you decided to get on a public platform and talk about Black women wearing bonnets in public is rooted in anti-blackness. Like, that's completely a possibility. But for you to frame it in a way where it's not possible, it's like, how do you decide that that's not what that is, when this wearing of bonnets is clearly associated with Black women in particular, more so than it is with any other type of person. You know what I'm saying? So
Right. And like a certain type of Black woman, right?
Right, a certain type. So then we get into class issues as well. Yeah, it's a certain type of Black woman that goes out in public wearing a bonnet on her head, and it just becomes very convoluted.
Yeah. And I think what people, I'm going to say people, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I think what white people don't understand is the work has to be done in people of color at a level that is so deep that I don't know if white people can engage in that process the way in which they want to, which comes back to privilege and having access and feeling like you have access to every little thing. Um, I would say that Black folks and people of color have to do this work in a space that is very uncomfortable. And I've so often not shared this part of my journey with my white colleagues or white friends because I don't want them to have access to this piece of my story, right? And so one thing that I really cling on to, and you'll probably hear it throughout this podcast, Greg, and you probably heard it in our private conversations. I will never critique the Black community, and that is because I would say critique in the sense of like I'm going to start calling out things, you know. I'm never going to critique it because I haven't lived my life in it fully. So I'm engaged in the Black community. I wouldn't say I live in the Black community. I certainly work in the Black community, but I have lived and worked in the white community. Therefore, I can start to criticize, critique, and just decolonize that. But when it comes to the Black community, my inclination is to simply listen and to uphold people with honor, right?
I
So
think that's important.
yeah, so like that decolonization process in myself, that is me knowing that, hey, I have European ancestry in my blood, which means I have light skin privilege. If y'all don't know what that means, I have the access to engage in the Black community, and also I have the privilege to step outside of it and to demonize it and to weaponize it for my own benefit to make white people feel more comfortable in institutions. Like that is very easy to do, um, especially as somebody who is most generally not any longer in where I serve now, but in my past, being a part of predominantly white institutions, it's like, oh, William's the token. He's going to tell us everything we need to know about the Black community, and I'm just like, no. One, you don't get access to that, and two, I necessarily don't get access to that. But what I can do is just sit and listen. And instead of critiquing, like, oh, they're lazy, oh, they're this, I'm like, actually, no. I I think humans can be lazy, absolutely. But to specifically say a certain group of people is predispositioned to being lazy, I'm like, okay, that's where I'm like, you obviously haven't spent time. So I'm more my whole perspective in terms of this story that you just shared is like, how do you bring and restore honor to that conversation? The critiquing of a Black woman, sure, you have access to that. Go ahead. But for me, who is not one, is not a woman, and is not a Black woman, I'm just like, I want to honor that the best I can without trying to speak into the process of like, oh, you're so right and da da da, because that assumes I have access to that. If that makes sense, that assumes I have the power to make a statement on that. Like my official opinion is this.
To me, to me as a Black man, I I don't necessarily think it's my job to critique Black people publicly, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, and that's another thing I've
Uh,
been really cautious about. I will
yeah,
never critique the Black community in public because I'm like, one, I haven't lived enough life and taken haven't been in spaces where I can like speak about it at length and with the education, honor, and all of that. So I will never rebuke. I will always uplift the Black community in public just for that
but
fact.
even in those who, so it's a, I guess it's a fine line. I don't like to critique the Black community publicly. Um, and for those that do, I think that for those Black people that critique the Black community publicly, I think they need to be aware of the implications of doing
Right,
of doing that,
right.
because it's very easy to sit behind a computer and do and say things. Like that's so easy. But I think I think we also have to be aware of the impact of things.
Hmm.
Um, so like intention of versus impact. Like you mentioned, sharing something that you think is funny or whatever, but like there are implications to things. And like this intention to impact is a whole nother topic. But I will say that Black people should be careful in how they choose to critique Black people publicly because it can cause you to appear a certain way. And I think what it does, I think when Black people choose to critique Black people publicly, it can reveal some anti-Black sentiments
Yeah,
that a
definitely.
Black person themselves harbors because as a consequence of being socialized in a white supremacist society.
Yeah, yeah. And real quick, as you were talking, I had this thought of just because it's public doesn't mean it's for you.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like as the listener, that doesn't mean it's for me. So I like rap music. I create rap music, and for artists who use the N word, it's like I said the word because it's in the song, and it's like right, but it wasn't for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for you. So things that are published publicly necessarily aren't. Yeah, we could do a whole nother podcast on that.
Well, no, that just a quick note about that. That notion of this word is not for you, that's been dissected many times,
right,
by people who are notable and who've spoken about that already. So
yeah, I am not notable.
Well, you know what I mean. But the knowledge is there and available. It's accessible to people who want to know why
Yes.
it's inappropriate to do that.
Yep, absolutely. And so, yeah, just because it's made for the public doesn't mean it's necessarily for you.
Right. And quickly, what comes to mind before I forget? There was a sports commentator, I think, who made a statement about a football player who happens to be a part of a Black fraternity. He's an Omega. And when he was on the football field, he did something that Omegas do that's associated with the fraternity, and the white sports commentator didn't know what it was.
Yes, yep, I remember that. Yeah.
And so he made a comment about it, and then he had to go back and retract and apologize for it being ignorant about another part of someone's culture. And people were asking, well, why was there a need to apologize? Well, first of all, it shows humility.
I'm glad you asked.
Secondly, I think it's only appropriate to do so when you speak in ignorance about someone else's culture.
Yes.
And you've been educated, and it's just only gracious to acknowledge that.
Yes, 100%. We could talk about this all day.
Yeah.
But I would love to dialogue about this question. I thought about it on the way over. One, for my own journey, as I was thinking about how white supremacy has played a role in my life, how it's presented itself, how I've enacted it at times, and how I've combated it. Right. And so this question of how much do I enjoy benefiting from white supremacy? That is something I'm currently sitting with, and I'm putting that at the center of my decolonization process to say, how much do I enjoy benefiting from white supremacy? Right. And so if I were to ask that question to a group, it's how much do you enjoy benefiting from white supremacy? And my gut instinct is say, like, I hate benefiting from white supremacy. And then as I dig deeper, I'm like, oh, shoot, I definitely am comfortable with some aspects of white supremacy that allow me access to resources and to live a comfortable life. And I'm blind to a lot of them, but some of them I'm like, oh man, like I need to remove myself from that or think of an alternative way to exist because I don't want that benefit of white supremacy. And one quick example is I mentioned I'm light skinned, and so that light skin privilege, being able to step in and step out whenever being able to step in and step out whenever I kind of choose, but I'm always in the middle of something. Being able to say, like, going into a predominantly white space and being like, okay, well, I'm going to speak for the whole colored community right now. That is a benefit I can receive. And in the spaces I navigate, people would welcome me on that stage, but I have to make sure that I am not doing this. Uh, I'm not exploiting this piece of myself for profit. Um, I'm very hesitant to take workshops now or do any type of videos for people about this because I've learned I can exploit this, and what happens is I commodify this experience, right? I start to commodify my own faith journey and say, hey, I'm going to make profit off of white supremacy by critiquing it, dismantling it, but at the same time, I'm enjoying the benefits of white supremacy financially. And
So in that way, you were resisting capitalism in that way.
right, exactly. And so I'm like, oh man, there was a point where I'm like, I'm accepting every offer that comes my way to talk about race and the church and white supremacy, reconciliation, all of that. But now I'm in a space of like, I don't want to do that. What do you think about this question of how much do you enjoy benefiting from white supremacy? If y'all don't know, Greg is a mastermind at just picking apart questions and nuances behind them. And so I want you to pick apart my question, Greg. How much do you enjoy benefiting from white supremacy?
Such accolades that I don't deserve. Such accolades that I don't deserve. Um, well, for what immediately came to mind was, like I mentioned when you were speaking earlier, is colorism. Um, I think for some people, being a light skinned black person is less alarming than being a darker skinned black person.
Yeah.
And like I am light skinned. My dad is light skinned. My mom is actually dark, but my dad is light skinned. So um I think what for me, because of how I have constructed dark skinned and light skinned black people in my own mind, which is probably a consequence of slavery, um, it for me, I feel like I benefit and I enjoy benefiting from being a light skinned black person. Because when I watch, and the reason another connection is Queen and Slim. For those who haven't seen that movie, you should watch it. Um, the two protagonists were both dark skinned and they were gunned down. Spoiler. At the end of the movie, they were gunned down. And I remember texting a friend, like after I watched the movie, I had to like just sit with myself for a few moments in my car,
Yeah.
kind of just get my thoughts. And I was texting her and I was like, it's something different about being dark skinned and black than being light skinned and black. It's something different about that. And
Mm,
light skinned black people definitely enjoy a privilege because I feel like in some people's minds, light skinnedness is more closely associated with a European standard of what's acceptable.
right.
And so there are benefits to that that come with
Hmm.
being light skinned. And I think that that's just something that, as I continue my own work of decolonization, it's something that I have to sit with and kind of pick apart.
Right, right. I love to have this conversation within the Black community. And, you know, there's all different perspectives on this because Black people are not a monolith. Spoiler alert. Not all Black people think the same. I love to say yes, in terms of if I were to transplant myself back when slavery was legal, I would probably be in the house, but that doesn't mean I'm home.
That's good.
We may do a podcast on colorism and all that later down the line because that's a topic I love to dissect and to talk about. But turning gears, Greg, what do you think the antidote to white supremacy is? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. Um, well, I think
James Cone. He said James Cone. James Cone's the antidote. Just take it.
no, I think the antidote is understanding um that we are all different. We bring different things to the table. Um And I do believe, me personally, I do believe that the gospel message of liberation provides an antidote, in that there is no reason that any person in society should be living in an oppressed state. I think it's quite simple, yet it's so complex at the same time, because we've built these notions of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable,
Right.
but it's all centered around whiteness.
Right.
And I think we have to just continue to do the work, because I always tell people, it's like, for me, I, I can't, I don't want to say, like, when I get into conversations with people about races, my whole thing is the same Christians that were racist back in the 1800s and were holding slaves, like, we they had the same Holy Ghost that you and me have, or we would think they did, at least, but yet they still felt that this was acceptable
Mm-hmm.
and perpetuated it. So I think the antidote is definitely a gospel message of liberation for all people, specifically Black people in a oppressed state where we are in America right
Right.
now. I think the
Right.
gospel message of liberation means something different here in America than it might mean for someone else somewhere in another part of the world.
I love that you draw attention to Black people specifically. I think so many times we talk about the Black community, and then we talk about folks of color, not non-Black people of color, and we kind of lump it all in as one. But what you do is you take it out of that box and say, yes, each one has to be handled with care and has its own culture that must be taken into place. But what you've been able to do, kind of with James Cone as a mentor and a guide, is to say, like, Black people specifically, I can talk specifically about Black people and feel no shame in that. I don't have to feel shamed for explicitly talking about Black people. And I think from my own experience, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you haven't experienced this as well. Whenever I bring up Blackness, it's always lumped in with something else to say, oh, well, it's not always about race, or, oh, well, all people matter. Oh, well, it's not just Black people, it's Latinx. Is like, yes, we affirm oppression across the board. Like, let's not get into a competition of oppression, because that's
The
the
oppression Olympics.
right,
Yeah.
right. I think that's white supremacy. That's the invisible wall. It's that oppressed people groups fight back and
But
forth.
we also have to understand that people exist at intersections too.
Yes, intersectionality.
So that's another piece. There's another layer to the conversation.
Yes. So
Well,
I love how you bring that to light for us, and you're not apologizing for it, and you're just saying, here's what it is, because I think it does deserve that platform. And just to remind us along the lines of this conversation, so we haven't really talked about theology or the church. We've been talking about broad culture, and we opened up with the Supreme Court. So how have you seen white supremacy kind of pervade this Christian space that many of us move in?
how have I seen white supremacy be pervasive in Christian spaces?
Yeah,
You mean like churches, for example?
sure.
And I wasn't even being funny.
I
I
know.
was sincerely asking the question. Well, I think about whiteness in biblical scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
It was so funny, and I love my dad to death. Like, that's my dude.
Yeah, he's a cool guy. Cool dude.
I will go hard for him.
I will go to his Bible studies, and I will say that about too many pastors.
Yeah. Yes, I will fight over my dad. But so my dad was, we should have him on the podcast at some point. He can talk about this more. He went to C.H. Mason Bible College here in Memphis. And I remember he let me borrow a book that he used in one of his classes. It was about, I think it was called Introducing Christian Doctrine. And I can't remember the author or the publisher or the editor of the book, but it was a white man. And I just thought to myself, and I didn't have this thought initially, but where I am in my mind and in my body now, I thought to myself, if this is the theology that permeates churches, black or white churches, um, and John MacArthur comes to mind because of his comments about slavery, and I'm like, and if you remember, William, I made a status about John MacArthur.
Oh, I remember.
What did I say?
Was it around his nickname of J Mac?
Yes.
Was it that one? Yeah. Look at you trying to test me.
It was, yes. I'm just sitting here trying to figure out, why are people calling him J Mac? As if you have a personal relationship with him, as if you know him. Like, it's just, that to me, that didn't sit right with me in my mind and in my spirit, especially considering his stances, his theology that he spews, from his position of power and privilege as a white male.
Yeah. And real quick, for those who don't know the significance of a nickname, it is associating yourself and aligning yourself at a personal level with somebody. So not calling them by their government name, but a name that is bestowed upon them in community. That's a really big deal.
It is. And the fact that these black people just did not sit well in my soul. It just did not. It just didn't. That bothered me so. And I just asked the question, why are people calling him J-Mac? Because this was right after that video had come out about him and his comments on slavery. And then for those of you, just go Google the video. Just go Google. It's out there. John MacArthur in slavery. And again, just this subjugation of different types of people, all in the name of Christ. Like, and it's it's masked in biblical values, but it's really just it's just oppression.
Yeah,
it's oppression to some person, that doesn't fit in the box.
Right. It's not good news if you're not. It's bad news if you're outside of the box, but it's wonderful news if you're inside the box.
Right. And I think, and we'll talk about this some other time, but I think that's why intersectionality is important. When we have these discussions of theology, I think it's extremely important, because somebody is not being recognized. Someone is not. We think about who's benefiting. We talked about it last time. Who's benefiting and consequently who doesn't benefit.
Right. Yep. And who has the resources to construct and to push out these theological, perspectives and resources. About a year ago, I made it a goal to only read people of color, particularly scholars. And I must say, I faltered in month 4. So a lot of my theology had been passed down through white men specifically. And that's why I think whenever I hear a woman preaching, I'm immediately intrigued, because it brings a different perspective. Even a male person of color, or a black male preaching, I'm like, your experience definitely informs what you think the good news is and how it's played out in your life. That's why I love testimony in stories. It's because you can't necessarily argue somebody's testimony or story.
Right.
If you do, it's super awkward. Be like, that didn't happen. Obviously, we've had cases where people have glorified their testimony and they've lied about it. But genuinely, when people talk about their experience with God, it's like, you can't really tell people how they felt when dialoguing with God. You just can't do that. And that's where, in our previous episode on the Bible, I do view that Bible in that lens for that particular reason, because I know the stories and the authorship. I'm like, your experience with God definitely was shown through these scriptures. It had to be. You were illuminated by the Spirit and your personality. I think it'd be super weird if God decided to write through somebody, but immediately took that person out of the equation. That just seems really weird to me.
Yeah, that's those people's experiences of God.
Yeah. So Oh man, white supremacy is a hot topic. Do you have anything else you want to share, Greg? And any thoughts come to mind before we close this out? I'm sure we'll have to do another episode on white supremacy because, spoiler alert, white supremacy never takes a day off, even though we have to. Injustice never rests, but we have to. And so, do you have any words of wisdom for the folks? Any personal tips that you've used to sustain yourself when fighting white supremacy?
Read Black authors, read Black scholars, read Black theologians. And this is when we plug a book, right?
Yeah. We're gonna put all of these things in our show notes to make sure that y'all have access to them. You don't have to pay to get access to them.
So while we're plugging, I'm gonna go ahead and plug.
Go ahead.
Kelly Brown Douglas, Sexuality and the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective. She's a scholar. She's a theologian, a womanist theologian. So there's some dissenting theology for you. That's my plug.
I love it. I will not come with a plug because I think I want to give that a platform all of its own, as it deserves. Doesn't deserve to be lumped in with other things. But we thank you for your time. We hope that something was said that piqued your curiosity. And as always, I hope you found value in this conversation. But above all, remember that decolonization doesn't happen in a day.
Peace.